Well, folks, gentlemen, we're all set to begin. Let's begin, first of all, with what Stephen Hawking said, and that was his claim that the laws of physics and not the will of God provides the real explanation for how life on Earth came into being. And Dr. Lennox, you're the scientist, so let me begin with you. Is this a new claim from the scientific world?
Not at all. I think that for the past while we've been getting people claiming that the laws of physics, even the laws of mathematics, can provide a satisfactory explanation for the origin of the universe. So there's nothing new here, and in my view, it's as self-contradictory as it's ever been.
Well, Ravi, does it surprise you that scientists who long ago dismissed God feel this need to continue to argue for his non-existence?
Not in the general sense, Bob, because I think there'll always be those who would want to drive this kind of thinking to the metaphysical realm, even though it's unfamiliar terrain to them in some ways. But I think it did surprise me that Stephen Hawking went this route. You wonder whether something controversial is what the listening or the reading audience wants to have in order to chase a book down or chase a program down, whether something of this nature was exactly the oil into the flames to get the book read and so on. But when he ended his last book, and his comment was that, now we've told you what, if we told you how or why, then we need the mind of God. Ending on that note of submission to something transcendent was a noble way to end. So I don't know what's driving this, but his comment on it actually did catch me by surprise. I have to say that.
It would actually appear, I heard just recently, that it was the publisher, Ravi, that got him to put that bit in at the end. Because people over here in the media are saying he's essentially been an atheist all along.
Well, this is fascinating if that is so. And sometimes I have known in other realms publishers pushing for a certain line or a certain statement or a certain name or a certain word, because that is precisely in this media-dense society of ours what gets the book bought and sometimes never read, but certainly to be put on the shelf out there.
Well, Dr. Lennox, you've said that Hawking's views are misguided because physical laws can never provide a complete explanation of the universe. Why not?
Well, let's step back from that a little bit. The chief flaw, as I see it, in Hawking's argument, and of course there's no question, he's a brilliant theoretical physicist. I was just a bit behind him in Cambridge, and he is a very brilliant man. The book opens with a statement that philosophy is dead, which is a very odd statement for a man to make when his book is all about philosophy and the philosophy of science. And it seems to me that it's here that he's making his principal error. What he's doing is offering us a set of false alternatives. Either God created the universe or physical law. It's not simply physical law providing an explanation, which of course they do at a certain level of certain things. He is actually claiming that we don't need a creator because there's a law of gravity. Let me quote exactly what he says. He says, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So he's saying that the law of gravity can displace God. Now, I have a series of objections to that. First of all, saying the universe is created from nothing is false because he says there is already a law of gravity, so it's not created from nothing. That's contradiction number one. Contradiction number two, which is even more serious, is that offering us a choice between God and the law of gravity is like saying this: here's a jet engine. I offer you the choice as an explanation of Frank Whittle, who invented it, or the laws of physics. That would be utterly absurd. In fact, you need both. You need both Frank Whittle, the agent who designed it, and you need the laws of physics. But it's even worse than that, because if you have Frank Whittle and the laws of physics, you still don't get a jet engine. You've got to have some matter for him to work on. And that brings me, sorry to go on a bit here, but that brings me to the central issue, and it seems to me a very serious mistake. That is, laws do not create anything. They are our descriptions of what normally happens. The laws of physics don't even cause anything. The law of gravity or Newton's laws of motion never set a snooker ball going on a snooker table in the history of the universe. They describe it once you've got it. So I wonder if that makes sense.
Well, Ravi, Dr. Lennox is talking about this conflict that Hawking has arranged, either God or science. How would you answer
And
that?
you're absolutely right, John. I think this is the irony of a man actually who is able to even speak to you and to me because of this unfortunate, debilitating disease of Lou Gehrig, where he's got this marvelous contraption through which he is able to process information, alphabet, language, sound. He would be the last one to self-reference that computer system as self-explanatory. It took the scientists and took the understanding of microchip technology and electronics and all of that and language to be able to take that which was possible and make it actual, because it still took the designer to give him that voice. I can no more look at a beautiful car going on the highway and say, there goes the internal combustion engine. You know, it takes the designer who harnesses the design capacity to bring it to you and to me.
Well, Dr. Lennox, you've written that those civilizations that have ignored God have suffered because of that. Could you explain that comment to us?
Well, what I wrote, I think you may be referring to a press article that I wrote. What I was referring to is one of the very interesting things in the history of science, that in Oxford, there's a very famous expert in China, Joseph Needham, and he was a Marxist, and what he tried to do was to explain the fact that there'd been no scientific developments really in the sense of modern theoretical science. In China, there'd been plenty of technology, but no scientific development, and he tried for a long time to understand this in terms of Marxist philosophy. But he ended by concluding that he couldn't do it that way. And he ended by concluding something like this, that the Chinese lacked the unifying concept of a creator. It seems to me this is enormously important in connection with Hawking, because the great men of science originally, like the person who held Hawking's chair, Sir Isaac Newton, their motivation for doing their science was actually faith in the creator. C.S. Lewis has put it brilliantly when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a creator. And so it seems to me there's an important lesson from the history of science. The contribution of the Christian belief in God is highly significant to the rise of modern science as we know it.
Let me take that down to a personal level. If you believed Hawking's claim, would you see a need to study science?
Well, it would depend which claim that Hawking is making, because he's claiming that what he's got is a final theory. It's very hard for me to put myself in the hypothetical situation of believing his claim, and I'll tell you why. Because the claim is self-contradictory at three different levels. I don't think I've ever met anything like that quite before. I mentioned it earlier. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, we've already seen the law of gravity, and gravity are not nothing. But listen to the second bit. The universe will create itself. Well, now, if I say X creates Y, what I mean is that I'm presupposing the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. That's common understanding of language. So if I say X creates X, I'm presupposing the existence of X in order to account for the existence of X. And that's self-contradictory, and it's logically incoherent, even if we do, as Hawking does, put X equal to the universe. And that sounds to me like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It's not science.
You know, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yes, you go ahead,
No,
Ravi.
please finish that thought. I was just going to leapfrog on that one there.
Well, Well, I was just going to say that the question to me was if I believed Hawking's claim, but I can't believe self-contradictory claims. And he sounds very much to me like Peter Atkins, an Oxford colleague, who said, space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own assembly. And I think one of the best comments on it was Keith Ward's comment. He's Regis Professor Emeritus of Theology here in Oxford. He says, look, it's logically impossible for a cause to bring about some effect without already being in existence. And then he ends, between the hypothesis of God and the hypothesis of a cosmic bootstrap, there's no competition. We were always right to think that persons or universes who seek to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps are forever doomed to failure. And that seems to be the heart of the matter, Ravi.
It's absolutely right, John. And you are familiar with John Conwell,
Yes.
who's the director of Cambridge Science and Human Dimension Project at Jesus College in Cambridge. And his comment, which is rather fascinating, in commenting on Hawking's conclusion, he says, dare I suggest that it be the oracular Professor Hawking who is failing to keep up with the philosophers and the theologians rather than the other way around. You know, I would actually go push this comment even further back. You go back all the way back to the days of Aquinas, and the idea of, you know, the three possibilities of uncaused, self-caused, or caused by another. And you've just taken us through that. To be self-caused, you'd have to exist before the effect. To be uncaused, you'd have to have a total existence of nothing, no thing, which something even Aristotle couldn't define when he said it's that which rocks dream about, bringing in the existence of a rock in order to talk of a dream. And so you get the uncaused and self-caused as actually ending up in some form of contradiction. It has to be the caused by another. And what Einstein said in the convergence of three ultimate realities, to him actually, you know, he talked about music, the laws of nature, and, quote, God or mind. I think he had that reverence for the possibility that something greater than merely a law was at work, and he was willing to take that step back and leave it in time and discovery. For absolute negation of this sort, to me, is nothing more than gimmickry and defies both science and logic.
Yes, it does indeed. And I think you hit there, Ravi, on a very important thing. At the very minimal level, what we're saying is this: there's got to be something more. Why is there something rather than nothing? And Hawking actually has failed to answer that question.
But you know, I remember listening to him, as I'm sure you did too, on more occasions than I did, John. And some of his views that he's propounded here actually have been along in his mind for a long time, and then now sort of in a co-authorship bringing this about. I remember listening to him at the Lady Mitchell Hall in 1990 when he was talking about determinism, because he found his own theory leading him to the unbreakable stranglehold of determinism. And at that point, I remember a question coming from the floor: how do you break free from determinism if naturalism is all you have to start with? And I remember him ending his talk with these words, and literally a groan going through the audience. He said, yes, we are all determined, but since we don't know what is determined, we may as well not be. That's the only way he sort of provided an escape hatch to sort of keep pursuing, even though everything was determined and all was by design moving towards an inescapable end with no mind ultimately behind it.
That's right. Oddly enough, you didn't know this. I was at that lecture.
Is that right?
we
Yeah.
were in the same room at the same time.
And you remember that well, don't you? Yeah, happening.
I do indeed.
Yeah.
And the very interesting thing is that he has brought this scientific determinism back into this book, and says the book is based on scientific determinism. And he says it's hard to see how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. And that it seems, and this is a quote, we are no more than biological machines, and free will is just an illusion.
Yep.
Now, that strikes me as very interesting indeed, because, of course, if he's as determined as he claims to be, then that takes all meaning away from the book he's just written that's supposed to convince us of that particular theory.
Right on, John. This is it. It's even if everything he's saying is true, it becomes a self-defeating endeavor, because then truth as a category is evicted, and he is hardwired to come to this conclusion.
I like to put it this way, Ravi, sometimes. You know, people say to me, you say that because you're an Irishman. and what they're committing is the genetic fallacy.
Yep.
Because they can give some sort of what they think is deterministic explanation, therefore what I say is of no value. Now, that's exactly what's happening here. And it's very interesting to see what a very eminent theoretical physicist, because that, of course, is what Hawking is, John Polkinghorne has to say. And he says this: in the opinion of many thinkers, human freedom is closely connected with human rationality. If we were deterministic beings, what would validate the claim that our utterance constituted rational discourse? Would not the sounds issuing from mouths or the marks we made on paper be simply the actions of automata? And then he says this: all proponents of deterministic theories, whether social and economic, Marx, or sexual, Freud, or genetic, Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, and he might well now add, or physics, Hawking, they need a covert disclaimer on their own behalf, accepting their own contribution from reductive dismissal.
Yeah, this is exactly what Berlinski strikes at too in his writings.
He does.
Yeah, I think this very end, I can just hear Dr. Polkinghorne saying this, having taken one of his great courses in quantum out there. This is the proviso they give for themselves while still asserting an absolute that really does not legitimize that proviso. I think the dangerous ground here to me, John, is so immense. We're really going back in some ways to psychological theories of the 60s and so on. If you remember, I remember at that point B.F. Skinner's book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Yeah. Same kind of ground will have to be traversed again. What are we going to do with the criminal? What are we going to do with choices?
It's a form of reductionism, of course, that actually undermines not only belief in God, that goes with the turf, but it undermines the rationality that we need to do science. So that what Hawking is doing in suggesting, for instance, as he does explicitly in the book, that human beings are nothing but molecules and atoms. This is back to Francis Crick and the astonishing hypothesis. But if it were true, how would we know it?
Yeah, and I think the word you use is key. That was my first reaction when I was reading his interview, and that was completely reductionistic. And then, of course, when he has to invoke some of the other Crick ideas that therefore a spaceship from somewhere will bring these other entities to us somehow and bring this all to a conclusion and understanding that there are other minds in the universe, so forth, it becomes something that is so beyond the pale of science that it seems to me almost ideologically driven, much more than scientifically driven, and that ideology reduces us to that bare minimum. What does this do of things like the value of human life? What does this do for something like the nature of love? The commitment of a parent to a child, the supererogatory acts of jumping into swirling waters to rescue somebody who cannot rescue themselves. All of these are suddenly put into nothing more than deterministic behavior without putting them into the category of love and nobility and truth and beauty and goodness.
Yes, and one of the causes of that, of course, is this scientism that really there is no other discipline that gives rise to truth. And by funneling everything into that narrow field, and not realizing, as other people have realized, that there are certain very big issues that science cannot deal with. It may be very good at describing the motion of the planets, but it can't deal with their beauty. It's good at telling us perhaps how neurons work, but cannot tell us about love. And as Einstein says, you know, and I like this quote very much, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you can't talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. That science has nothing to say about ethics. And it's this all-encompassing belief that science can give us everything that leads to reductionism that, in the end, devalues human life.
I remember the famous rock musician saying, "Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind I see is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. And if we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying." Musicians can extend the ideas of philosophy and science and bring it to a knife-edge feeling of reality. How far we've come from the days of Michael Polanyi and his reminder in Personal Knowledge that we must have a healthy respect for how we even arrive at deductive inferences drawn from the sciences, or we move into a terrain that is delegitimized by the very constrictions of the discipline.
Well, Ravi, let's talk about what we finished our last video discussing, and that was the way science views God. Stephen Hawking, in his book, made this comment. Let me read it to you. He wrote, "The question is the way the universe began chosen by God for reasons we can't understand, or was it determined by a law of science? I believe the second. If you like, you can call the laws of science God, but it wouldn't be a personal God that you can meet and ask questions." Ravi, how would you respond to that?
Well, you know, when you take a designer, you have intent and you have will. When you take chemistry and you say, or physics, and say, this is all there is to it, do you realize at that moment, Bob, what they actually end up doing? You can never define good or evil without first defining purpose. That is, purpose is intrinsic to the definition of good and evil. And dare I raise a very difficult question then. If a personal God is implicitly debunked by the scientists, what does that say about personality? What does that say about personal worth? We are ultimately configured by matter. So matter is prior to who we are. This is, I think, another point that Einstein made, and by the way, which Anthony Flew, in one of his chapters in the book, There is a God, Flew takes issue with the atheists, especially Dawkins and so on, who refer self-reference laws. And Flew gives numerous quotations, even from people like Heisenberg, of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of fame, and Einstein and so on, who sort of have this veiled realization of some entity that has to be assumed behind the scenes, however we ultimately describe him. They don't want to give it the anthropomorphisms that we give or the Judeo-Christian attributes, but they want a respect given to a transcending mind. And so to take away the possibility of a personal God is to ultimately destroy the value of personality itself. So I think Hawking once again here moves into a realm that I'm willing to give you some power, but I don't want a mind. I don't want a personal God. We have given him personal worth. He gives us personal worth by writing to us, all of which is nothing more, with no ontic referent, to give you personal value. When psychology deals with issues of personality, morality, and reality, all of them assume some kind of point of reference. You take away a personal God, Bob, and I think you have opened up an arena of discussion that cannot respond to the most plaguing questions of our time.
Could I just make a side comment on this? Mm-hmm. On the actual statement, if you like, you can call the laws of science God, but it wouldn't be a personal God that you can meet. I find that a very revealing statement for the following reason, that dismissing God, the creator. They don't dismiss the concept of creation. They have to ascribe creatorial power to something else. And here Hawking describes it, and this is another astonishing thing to my mind. He doesn't describe it to matter and energy, as often is the case. He describes it to something abstract. That is, he describes it to a law of nature, but you only have to think for a moment. And it seems to be, as a scientist, very odd for someone to do that. Laws of nature are abstract, and they depend on the prior existence of a nature for which they are laws. So that to call them God in any sense and as responsible for nature is just very, very confused indeed. And it seems to me that we're standing up against, again, the great choice. That either one believes there's a personal God behind the universe separate from it who created it and upholds it, or else you ascribe creatorial power to fundamental particles and the laws of nature. But you'll notice in all of this that Hawking doesn't tell us where the laws come from.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm reading an interview done by Wolfgang Pannenberg, in which he was asked the question if he believed in God, in a personal God, and he says this, fascinating: "May I rephrase your question? I myself should prefer the following formulation. Can you or anyone else reach the central order of things or events whose existence seems beyond doubt as directly as you can reach the soul of another human being? I am using the term soul," says he, "quite deliberately so as not to be misunderstood." Then he says this: "If you put your question like that, I would say yes. If the magnetic force that has guided this particular compass, and what else was its source but the central order, should ever become extinguished, terrible things may happen to mankind, far more terrible even than concentration camps and atom bombs." That's, you know, that's a quantum theorist saying, take away the order. This is not completely random. When the more the accretion of particles and instruments and the very human mind, he says there's a soulishness to this. And so to basically say that you can call the laws of science God is trying to find a way to escape the inevitable logic of his own thinking and giving a personification to an idea, because that then gives him a will that he wants to bring in.
Dr. Lennox, do scientists know their limitations on theology?
Well, some do, some don't. I think it's not a question of limitations on theology. You're raising a very important point. We referred to it very briefly earlier when I talked about scientism. That is the view that science is the only way to truth. Now, it seems to me that one of the very important things is for scientists like myself, and I'm very passionate about science, to realize that science is limited. And it's very interesting on this to contrast Bertrand Russell with Peter Medawar. Bertrand Russell was a brilliant mathematician, but he was the one who said, although he didn't completely follow this through, but he did say that what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. And that's a classic self-refuting statement, because it's not a statement of science, and therefore, if it were true, we cannot know it. So his great gift at logic seemed to leave him at that particular point. Sir Peter Medawar, on the other hand, he said this: it's very easy to see that science is limited. It cannot answer the simple questions of a child: where am I coming from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of life? And then he added, we've got to turn to literature and philosophy if we want any answers to those questions. And he pointed out that it does no service to science for scientists to claim that science can answer everything. And he was, this is in a very famous book that I would suggest that every scientist could read. And incidentally, it's a favorite book of Richard Dawkins, I believe. At least Peter Medawar was a hero for him, called The Limits of Science. So it's very important to realize that. But you mentioned theology, and it's a sad thing that many people, particularly the new atheist movement, they assume that theology is a matter of faith. They then assume that faith is believing where there's no evidence. So that the deduction from both of those things is that you can't take anything in theology seriously. So they don't. So therefore they don't even inform themselves as to what serious theological debate has given us over the centuries. And so the limitation of their knowledge on God is very great indeed.
You know, I would bring, that's great, John, you're absolutely right, and we're grateful to the Lord that you're there. For the listeners who are not aware of John Lennox, here's a man who's a holder of triple doctorates in science and philosophy. Here's what I would say. There are two edges to this question, Bob, very important for the listener to hear me very carefully here. Think about this, and I don't mean to be audacious. When you take a man like Stephen Hawking, brilliant, amazing capacity to reel off equations, page after page after page, without looking at a note, because of the brilliance of his mind. Isn't it fascinating that a man so restricted, confined, because of this horrible, debilitating disease, some relativist who did not know the capacity of his mind, but knowing the capacity of this disease, having seen Hawking in the mother's womb, I know there are relativists and ethicists today who would have called for his elimination in his mother's womb. The very reason that a man like this exists and is given the dignity and the respect and the love of human beings and life is because of the Judeo-Christian value that every life has essential worth. Sickness or no sickness, disease or no disease, debilitation or no debilitation. Fascinatingly, he lives by the application of an ethic which in effect is debunked by his physical theory of origins and purpose and meaning and destiny. So he's living off the capital of a worldview that is being knocked by the book. That's the first thing. Those listening need to realize that the love and the value that is given to every human life is given to us because we see ourselves as created and loved by God. But the second edge of that is this. The church needs to wake up and do theology the way theology needs to be done. We have sent young minds into the arena without bringing unity in the diversity of the disciplines. Philosophy is important. Literature is important, science is important, and so is theology, which used to be called the queen of the sciences once upon a time, and then theology was displaced by religion, which is man-made, rather than seen as divine in its ultimate pursuit. So I just think there are two edges to this. Those who trumpet the idea that God is dead need to realize that the very persons who are trumpeting it are given value and worth because of a belief in intrinsic worth, something their philosophy cannot sustain. And we, as a part of the Church of Jesus Christ, need to wake up and realize how best to prepare young minds to bring a confluence of these disciplines and not to ignore these questions as they come up.
I'm tempted to add, Ravi, perhaps rather facetiously, but I will add it, that also many of these people trumpeting these ideas are doing them in educational institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, which were Christian foundations. And the basic freedoms, and it seems to me actually, and you're hinting at that, talking about ethics, but in general, our basic sense of human rights and freedoms are something that's been given to us historically in the West by Christianity. And these arguments are eroding them, but the people are only free to make the arguments because of the freedom that those traditions have given them.
So right on, John, and I think that is possibly part of the extension of what Heisenberg would have said there that if we take away that central factor of design in some way, or a central order, and then you and I recognize that order doesn't come from things, it comes from the mind of God himself, that catastrophes and other ideas will take sway that'll make the concentration camps and all look very tame. I believe this debate will always continue because there'll be always those who will find a market for ideas like this. But the central belief in the existence of a personal, loving God who gives us our moral dimensions and our ability to reason will be indispensable to carry this world forward. And we as philosophers, theologians, and scientists who follow Christ, follow where God is leading us in our understanding of things, need to take these disciplines seriously, and especially take our responsibility to the young.
Let me finish with a final question to both of you. We started this discussion talking about how this was not a new idea. This has been out there before, and these ideas have been debunked before, but it's making a huge splash now. We have a colleague in South America who says it's all over South America, Hawking's recent comments. Ravi, why do you believe it's getting such attention now, even though these are not new ideas?
Well, these ideas sort of hit the fan because I think in some ways, some people, like Aldous Huxley said in 1946, he wants this world not to have meaning because a world without meaning gives him an autonomy to his ethics and his moral framework. So we all like to think, aha, I can run free now, no more restrictions, no more moral ideas. That may be one, that it gives them the legitimacy of autonomy. The other thing I think is they sort of see this imposition of a God idea with all of its conflicts and tensions and religion and all that it has created, do away, consider it all passé, and walk away from it. That may be another reason. The third one may well be that science is being given this sort of central chair in everything, and therefore Stephen Hawking has spoken, quote, therefore God has spoken of reality. Whatever the motivation, I don't think it'll ultimately linger this way. When ideas come and take sway, they linger for a little while. They become the topic to discuss. In the West, particularly, anything beyond 90 days is sort of passé and old. And I frankly think, on the positive side, many scientists who are not even Christians or theists for that matter, and philosophers have risen to this and said, this emperor has no clothes. And Hawking, they think, some have said, like Roger Penrose and others who worked with them, has done himself a disservice by moving in this direction. And so it doesn't even take the theist to have to respond. It takes other brilliant scientists to say, this is not scientific, or as John Polkinghorne would have said, pure speculation.
Dr. Lennox?
Well, my reaction is very similar to Ravi's, that I think possibly part of the aggression in the country where I come from, Northern Ireland, aggression is usually associated with weakness of argument. And I think that some atheists, at least, are running out of real arguments. The second thing is that the cultural authority of science, because it's given us spin-offs in technology, is enormous. And therefore, when famous scientists speak, people think that everything they say comes with the authority of their science. But of course, not all things that scientists say are statements of science, and we've got to learn to distinguish. And in that context, I'd like to end my contribution by saying that throughout this discussion we've had, and it's been very interesting to me, we need to keep one thing clear. Ravi and I are not talking about a conflict between true belief in God and true science. That's the way that so many atheists want to paint it. You either believe in God or you believe in science. And as I said directly to Richard Dawkins in one of our debates, I said that is a false choice. And if you give it to people, some of them might just want to believe in God, so that you could be accused of actually turning people away from science. What I'd like to emphasize, and Ravi hinted at it in his last couple of sentences, is this. This debate that will go on is much deeper. It's a debate between two worldviews. The worldview of materialism or naturalism on the one side that says this universe is all that exists and there is nothing that transcends it. And the world of theism, and in our case Christian theism, that says this world is not all that exists. There is a creator who created it, and it depends on him. That is the battle. And the crucial thing to see is that there are scientists on both sides of it. And that tells us very clearly that it's not a simplistic warfare between science and religion. It's a worldview warfare, and science is being called in to adjudicate.
Well put, John.
Well, Dr. Lennox, thank you very much for taking time to join us from across the pond, and we do appreciate your time.
It's a great pleasure, and I just hope you've understood my across-the-pond accent.
We'll do the interpreting from here, John. God bless you, friend. Great to have you on.
Thank you very much indeed.